And actually, I have to give credit to the very first forensic panel that examined the evidence, was the Fisher panel that looked at the autopsy photos and x-rays. And they're the ones who noticed that large metal fragment that's in the back of the president's head. And that panel thought that, gee, that looks like a shrapnel fragment. And of course, they didn't put that in their report. This came out later in an interview with Dr. Fisher. And that struck me, and I realized that, well, yeah, that explains why the wound in the back of the head through the scalp was tunneling and upward slanting, how do they describe it, as a laceration in the back of the skull, which exactly would fit. And going back and reading the testimony of the eyewitnesses who were standing in front of the limousine, in front of the book depository, and how several of them had said they had seen something hit the street next to the limousine.
Sure. Many more people, including those that, were familiar with firearms, talked about the first shot being a firecracker. And I wonder if the sound of hitting pavement might bring that impression on them.
Yeah, it's hard to tell what people's impressions of sound. Yeah, a lot of them felt the first shot sounded more like a firecracker.
No.
And that gets into another problem, another issue. But the other part about the shrapnel was that Kennedy, his first reaction was to suddenly flinch. He jerked forward, he brought his arms up in front of his body and shook his head back and forth. Mm-hmm. And then according to the Secret Service agent who was in the car, he heard Kennedy say, "My God, I'm hit," which taken together, not just one thing, all taken together, it sure sounds like the best explanation for that fragment in the back of on the outside of his skull is just as the forensic experts thought. It's probably a shrapnel fragment.
Interesting. So now that the second shot around Zapruder frame 204 is something you call the rogue shot because it doesn't match either book depository or the knoll as the source of the shot, and therefore I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, it does match to the book depository. The problem is that it's too close in time to the earlier shot to have come from Oswald's rifle. When the FBI tested Oswald's rifle, the fastest they could cycle it, and this is both the FBI and the Army Weapons Testing Branch. 3 different guys from each organization tried that rifle, and the fastest guy that could rotate cycle the gun and fire 2 shots was 2 1/4 seconds. And those shots are spaced by only a little over 1 and a fraction seconds. It's like one was 1.6 seconds. So it's too close to the earlier shot. So they can't both have come from the same Mannlicher Cartana rifle.
But by the way, when you say book depository shots, I'm curious as to how accurate the analysis of the source of the shots were. In other words, are we talking sniper's nest or somewhere in the general vicinity of the book depository?
Yeah, not real accurate at all, because the most important factor that determines the origin of the gunshot, the sound, the echo pattern is going to arrive at the motorcycle, is the position of the motorcycle relative to the buildings and not to where the shooter was. And if you go, the only one that was analyzed closely, of all the 5 shots, the only one that was analyzed closely to try to determine the origin was the grassy knoll shot. Now that each of the other shots, I'll go back a little bit, when the acoustic experts did their analysis, remember they had these 72 test shot patterns, and they had 36 microphone locations at 18-foot separations. In theory, that motorcycle is probably not going to be exactly where that motorcycle is. Mm-hmm. It's probably going to be somewhere in between them. And as a consequence, they got multiple matches. Now, in all but one instance, those multiple matches were at adjacent microphones. But furthermore, in several of those instances, there were shots that matched. For example, the very first pattern had 4 matches. One of those was a shot from the grassy knoll. But it matched to a lesser degree than the shot that was the test shot from the book depository. And so you really can't pinpoint where the shot came from based on the original BBN analysis. The only one that actually pinpointed the origin of the gunshots, of any of the shots, was that was when Weiss and Ashkenazi studied that shot from the grassy knoll, that fourth shot. And it was very much in line with that FBI argument that said, well, hell, how do we know that there isn't a shot, a backfire, or a large firecracker, which could have been anywhere in the vicinity? That's a valid argument, and that's why Weiss and Ashkenazi had to pinpoint it down to within a foot or two of where the actual shooting was.
I see, but so for the shots that are supposedly book depository shots, they certainly could have been from a different part of the book depository, or possibly even something like a Deltex building. Is that far off?
Yeah, exactly. The book, we presume that they're from the book depository because the eyewitnesses look up and saw a guy with a gun shooting at the president from that window. So presumably some of these really are an assassination gunfire. Well, then some of them have to be
sure, but if you have
from the book depository. But at least one, that second one that I call the rogue shot, that one is the one that's the very least likely that couldn't have come from the same rifle. It's got to be from